If you enjoy listening to adventure stories, then you should visit theDIHEDRAL.com. You will find stories from other members of the community and read about climbing, life, and the outdoors. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Let's connect and climb on!
Climb on! Roll! Hello, everyone. This is Carrot, welcoming you to another episode of the theDIHEDRAL podcast. We're so fortunate to be joined again by one of our favorite guests. He's the award-winning author of The Simple Plan to Wealth, and he just released his follow-up book, Pathfinders. J.L. Collins is a gentleman's gentleman. Everything I know about investing comes directly from reading his books and his blog, which you can find at jlcollinsnh.com. From my point of view, his financial advice is the best there is, and I'm happy to have him join us once again. So, JL, welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for coming back.
Well, thanks for all those kind words and for having me back. It's always fun chatting with you.
I just finished Pathfinders, and I have to say it was awesome. I loved it. I loved the way that it was set up. I loved the intros that you did for each chapter. The stories were phenomenal. But I think probably my favorite part was the interview at the end with you and your daughter. I mean, from cover to cover, it was an excellent read. And I want to talk about the process and what you've gone through to put this book together. But before that, maybe we can talk about your motivation, like what pushed you to write this particular book.
So when The Simple Path to Wealth came out in 2016, I wrote that book for my daughter. That's one of the reasons that we do the interview at the end of Pathfinders.
Right.
And my daughter was in college at the time, so she was at the beginning of her journey, and she's an American. And I've been asked, why is the advice in The Simple Path to Wealth so specific? And it's because this is what I tell my daughter that she should do. So but I've been amazed when The Simple Path to Wealth came out. I was hoping it would do well. I've been a little stunned at how well it's done. But the remarkable thing was the stories that started coming back to me of people all over the world. So in very different parts of the world, very different parts of their journey, not necessarily at the beginning of their journey, and how they'd taken this kind of specific book written for one person and adapted the principles and lessons in it to their own situations and lives and wherever they were living. And these were incredible stories. And so Pathfinders is a book that I wanted to do literally since 2016, maybe 2017. And it's been 2 years in the making. Harriman House and I started talking about this back in, it would have been the fall of 2021. And yeah, I knew I'd found my partner to make it happen. So as I said to you a moment ago before we started the interview, I put out the call to ask people to send in their stories. We didn't know for sure whether we would get a big enough response for the book, but we got more than enough response. So then we had the challenge, of course, going through all the cool stories we got and picking out the 100 best and then and building the book around those. So that's the origin.
No, that's great. Before we get too far into Pathfinders, I wonder if you could give a quick elevator pitch about The Simple Path to Wealth, like just to get people caught up so they can kind of understand how Pathfinders works it's independent, but it kind of works as a sequel.
Yeah, well, in some ways, I think Pathfinders is almost the better introduction to this whole idea and process of becoming financially independent. Clearly, I couldn't have written Pathfinders until after The Simple Path to Wealth, but now that they're both out there, one of the questions I got early on is, well, do I have to have read Simple Path to Wealth first before Pathfinders? And the answer to that was obviously no. Pathfinder stands on its own, but as I reflected on it more, I thought, not only do you not have to have written or read Simple Path to Wealth, but in some ways, if you're new to this whole concept, Pathfinders is the better introduction to it because it's filled with stories of people who are doing it from all different kinds of situations. And so if you read Pathfinders and it resonates with you that, wow, this is a cool thing and it sounds like something that could fit in my life, well, then The Simple Path to Wealth is sort of the owner's manual is how to actually implement it. And The Simple Path to Wealth is, to finally answer your question, is simply refuting the idea that investing is complex. And of course, investing is complex because Wall Street makes all these complex products. And they do that because that's how they make money. And that drives people into their arms because, oh, this is too complex for you to handle on your own. And now we get our big fees and commissions and everything. And so when you hear about investing, at least in the general media, it sounds complex because what you're hearing about is genuinely terribly complex. And that's the bad news. The good news is you can sweep all that off the table and onto the floor because all you really need are really simple investments. And those are low cost, broad-based stock index funds. So the simple path to wealth, the formula is you live on less than you make, you avoid debt because you can't become wealthy with debt, and you invest the surplus. Now, you invest the surplus initially paying down your debt, if that's what you have. If you don't have any debt, then you go right into using that surplus to build your wealth, again, in those low-cost, broad-based index funds. Very simple formula.
And we might as well just throw it out there. You're a big fan of Vanguard index funds, right? Like if you're going to make a recommendation, Vanguard is the way to go.
So you're absolutely right. And in fact, I've actually been accused of being on Vanguard's payroll.
I could see that.
And my response to that is, if only, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
They should put me on their payroll.
Oh man, they should for sure.
But I'm not. But I love Vanguard for a lot of reasons that we can get into if you want to go there. But I also have to say, so when The Simple Path to Wealth, which again was written for my daughter, I very specifically tell her to invest in VTSAX. And VTSAX is Vanguard's Total Stock Market Index Fund. Now, the ETF version of that, ETF being exchange traded fund, being exchange traded fund is VTI, if I remember that correctly. And it's the same portfolio. So I get that question a lot. Does it have to be the fund or can it be the ETF? But by the same token, because Vanguard and Jack Bogle, who founded Vanguard and created index funds, because he created these things that benefited us investors enormously with low costs and really gave the individual investor a fair shake for kind of the first time ever. This goes back to 1975. Well, the initial reaction from the rest of the firms out there were to try to strangle this in its crib. When that didn't work, they were eventually dragged kicking and screaming, and from competitive point of view, to offer their own versions of these broad-based low-cost index funds. So the truth is, a total stock market index fund like VTSAX is the same in T. Rowe Price or in Fidelity or what have you. That's another question I get a lot. If I'm with Fidelity and I've got I forget what their ticker is for theirs, but I've got their total stock market index fund. Is that okay? And the truth is, yeah, that's okay. Vanguard is my preference because of the way they're structured, and they're the people who invented it, and that's sort of in their DNA. But an index fund is an index fund to a certain extent.
That's perfect. That's very well put. So just to go back to Pathfinders, we have The Simple Path to Wealth. It comes out, people read it, and some hop on this path. And so then they give you their stories. And I don't know how many came in, but the book lays out, what did you say, around 100 different stories?
There are just about 100, right?
All right. So it's like asking a parent to pick out their favorite child. But I'm wondering if you could share with us a couple of your favorite stories that you really felt drawn to.
Well, you're right. It is like asking a parent who's your favorite child. But I'm actually going to turn that question around on you.
Yeah.
Because there is one story in here that, when I was thinking about our conversation, that leaps out to me as relevant to you and to your audience. And I'm wondering if you have any thought as to which one I'm thinking of.
All right, I might. So I literally have my book open right now. I was going to ask you specifically about the story. I was actually going to ask you if I could read a portion of it because I think it appeals to dirtbags so much. And so it's called Two Kinds of Wealth by Tiffany S. It's on page
That's actually
25.
that's actually not the one I
What?
had.
That was my favorite one. I can't wait
But-
to hear what one you were thinking of.
All right, well, let's talk about your favorite one first. What page? I've got my book here too. So what page is that
Yeah,
on?
it's on page 25.
On page 25. So it's going to be in the same section as the one I thought you were going to choose. So that's the
Man,
section
so-
on freedom, which I kind of assumed might be your favorite section.
It was my favorite section, and it comes in the beginning of the book, which I mean, it was a hook. I got in, I was like, okay, this is a great book. So I don't know. Why don't we do this? Maybe I can read. I don't want to read the whole thing. I want people to experience for themselves, but maybe I can read a couple of the paragraphs, and then I can just get your thoughts on that. Would that work for you?
Absolutely. Go ahead. Read the paragraphs that stood out to you.
All right. So I mean, the whole thing did, but really two in particular. So it's just the second paragraph, and Tiffany says, this is when people ask her about their adventures. They're dirtbags. They travel around and they do stuff on a dime. I always respond that we have only engaged in activities we felt matched our abilities. We never sought to take uncalculated risks. We made decisions based on our skills and stage of life, such as when we geared up to do an 11-day trek around a remote island in New Zealand. At some point, we realized we could apply this mindset to our finances. They don't need to be scary or mysterious. Deciding what to do with our retirement savings really is no different to deciding if we were fit to be able to safely go off trekking on our own in the mountains of Nepal or Chile. And so that one, I was like, that's what we do. Like we take calculated risks. And I think a big problem for me, until I stumbled upon your website and read your book, is, like you said a little while ago, investing just seems so complex. And when you know about climbing and we know about approaching trails, it becomes simpler and simpler and simpler. And so when she wrote that, I was like, yeah, that's me. Like I didn't know what I was doing, but it's a calculated risk. I just love the way that she compared those risks. I thought it was a great piece of writing, and I did like that she was talking about the mountains too.
Yeah, so I think that is a great analogy. As you know, I am not a rock climber. And so the whole idea of what you guys do is mysterious and a little bit appalling to me, and especially when I see the videos of somebody going up this vertical, especially when they're doing it without ropes or anything. But I'm sure that excuse me, I'm sure that behind that there's a lot of thought. And there's a lot of practice and education and what have you that goes into developing those skills to be able to do something like that. And the better you know the subject, the less mysterious it is and the more doable it is. Right. And I think it's the same thing as I was trying to explain a moment ago with investing. And it just looks so complex out there. But the stuff that really works and gives you the best results is, ironically enough, the stuff that requires the least effort. And I imagine that's kind of true with rock climbing. You know, if you don't quite know what you're doing, it's probably going to take a lot more energy and effort and be a whole lot riskier. Right. And if you do know what you're doing, you're probably going to do it much more efficiently and with far less risk. So I think, I can see why that story resonated with you.
Oh, absolutely. I loved it.
But now if you flip a couple of pages further up.
All right, let's do it.
This is page 32. This is the one I thought that you would have picked out.
Oh my God. Yeah. That one was a great one too. That's even more to the point where it's just like, yes, this is what we do. This is how we live. Not all of us, but of course, no, that if I was going to pick two, that would have definitely been the second one for sure.
Right. Just so our audience knows what we're talking about.
This one JL, thank you. And you and I are having a conversation. I forgot there were other people listening.
Yeah, we have to remember that there are people who want to follow along with it. But this story is titled "Minimum Wage but Maximum Freedom," and it's by a guy who goes by Out of the Box Traveler, which is he's a Canadian, perfect handle for somebody like this. But he talks about basically being a ski bum and spending time in the mountains, and you know how he has not only he works in restaurants, and he house hacks, and he does all these cool things to make not only that affordable, but by working 3-4 months a year, he not only pays all of his bills for all year, so he can spend the rest of the time playing, but he's also building his wealth on the side. Talk about a guy who has organized his life in such a fashion that he's not spending every dime that he makes, that he's living on less than he earns, and he's investing the difference. So yeah, those are two great stories, particularly for your audience. But now let me answer the question you actually asked me. Some of my favorite stories, those two are certainly high on the list. But one of the things I like about this book is I don't think anybody can read this book and say pursuing financial independence can't be done, that it's not doable. And that's, ever since I started writing in this space back in 2011, that's always been the pushback. Oh yeah, becoming financially independent, that sounds great if you're a highly paid engineer, and you're getting, big incomes and what have you. Tell you what, let me just take a quick moment to turn off my emails so we don't have those irritating dings. I should have done that soon. So some of my favorite stories are, there's a guy who grew up as a child migrant laborer, picking asparagus in the fields when he was a kid, and the family still does that. He's on the verge of becoming a millionaire. There's a story in there from somebody who says, when I was growing up, the rich people were the ones who had flush toilets.
Right.
So there are a lot of stories in this book, and there are some stories from the more typical engineering. There's stories from this couple from Ohio, moved to Silicon Valley, made the big bucks, lived modestly while they were there, saved and invested their money, and then they moved back to Ohio, did a little geo arbitrage. So those are some of my favorite stories that really show this can be done by anybody. And almost no matter what your situation is listening to this, there's probably somebody in this book who has it tougher than you do. And
absolutely
started on the path and is doing it successfully. And then the other stories that I like to flag, because the two that were most surprising to me as we were going through it, we have a story in there from a guy in Ukraine.
Right.
In fact, he has a podcast. I just did an interview with. His name's Roman. That podcast just released.
Oh, I can't wait to listen.
Yeah, he's a great guy. It's frankly a great interview. His story in the book is great. Here's a guy who's living in a country that's been invaded. It's at war. His assets in country have been frozen. And not only is he pursuing financial independence, not only is he walking the simple path to wealth as best he can under circumstances, but he has a podcast and an audience of people who are doing it.
So cool.
The other story, and sort of the flip side of that coin, is there's a story from a Russian guy.
Yeah.
Now, here's a guy who lives in a country that is the invader, who has massive economic sanctions against it, which of course has created high inflation and just a terrible environment. And yet he's pursuing the simple path to wealth. Those were the two that were probably most surprising to me, just because of what's going on tragically between those two countries. But fascinating stories, both of them.
Oh yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but those were organized back to back, right? We went Ukraine and then Russia in the book.
Right, because they fall in the category of staying the course, right? So the book is broken up into 9 sections. The first 2 stories we talked about are in the first section called Freedom, which is not surprising. You found your favorites in that section.
Makes sense.
But there are 9 other sections, and one of those sections is staying the course, because if you're going to achieve financial independence, you have to continue walking down the path, no matter what the obstacles are. And of course, what's going on in Ukraine, and for that matter, what's going on in Russia, presents significant obstacles to walking this path. And yet there are people doing that. So they both are in that section. Now, of course, there's no love lost between those two countries at this point. So
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head though. There's some stories in here where your heart just hurts for some of the people. And it wasn't always just like, oh, here's a great success. There's some people who ended up who have to say, I'm still trying, like I'm doing my best, and hopefully I get there. Whether it's a single mom, but I can't remember the exact details, but I was really pulling for this guy. He's been working, I think, on financial independence for a long time, and he would get married and lose everything and then married again. It was just like, my God, this guy's got the worst luck in the world.
So that guy, his name is Tom. Tom's a personal friend of mine.
Okay. Oh, that's even better.
And that's Tom was actually back in the day a client of mine when I was in my corporate career. And Tom, in fact, I just saw Tom earlier this year. He lives in the Detroit area, and we were passing through Detroit. But yeah, he's a guy, he's a couple of years older than I am. So he's in his mid 70s. And he's a guy that when he turned 62, he was bankrupt. His house was repossessed. He lost everything and couldn't get a job. He was in the advertising business, which caters to youth. Nobody, as he says, nobody wanted a 60-plus-year-old account man at that point. So he lost everything. And he took his early Social Security at 62, which of course means you get a lower benefit, but he had to have something. He has a tiny pension from one of the companies he worked for, like a couple $100 a month. But then, because Tom's a very resourceful guy, he got a job as a farmer in the Henry Ford Museum. Has a period farm from the 1800s. So Tom is one of the guys who dresses up in period costumes. They actually run an operating farm. So Tom, in his elder years, is out getting exercise and fresh air and socializing, which he's great at. Tom is probably the least financially successful person I personally know.
Yeah.
He is also the happiest person I know.
Tom's great.
And that's the reason that I treasure his story, because so many people in this space, and obviously I believe in saving and investing and trying to become financially independent, but so many people in this space worry about it so much. So much fear around it. I hear from people who have a couple of $1 million, sometimes more, and they're filled with fear about losing it, or do I have enough? Yeah. And the truth is that, you really, and I'm sure your audience appreciates this more than most, it really doesn't take that much to meet your basic needs. Right. As long as you don't let lifestyle inflation run away with you, which is another section in the book, by the way, meeting your basic needs, which is what Tom had to do, is not that difficult, and then building from there. And you can be happy without a lot of things. So certainly if you're anyway on the road to financial independence, as I say, it's not a destination, it's a journey. So certainly there's a mathematical point where you have enough money that your money can support you. But every step you take along the way getting there, you're a little bit stronger than you were the day before, right? Yeah. So but it's remarkable to me when I look at all the people that I've met over the years. Probably the least financially successful guy is also the happiest, because that's who Tom is.
Man, he sounds great. I usually make it back to Michigan, probably at least once a year. Next time, I don't know if he's still going to be farming, but I'll look to see if I can meet him. That'd be really cool to say hello.
I have in Wisconsin, where we have the cottage on the lake. I'm good friends with my neighbor, who's a guy named Al. And Al came back from a trip one time, and he was saying, we were over by Detroit, and we stopped at this Henry Ford Museum, and they had this farm there, and it's kind of really cool, these period guys. And I got to talking to this really neat guy, and he had a picture of him.
No way.
He'd taken a selfie. And they said, that's my buddy Tom.
No way. That's crazy. Man, that's awesome. So
Yeah.
look, there's a lot of really interesting voices in the book, but yours doesn't get washed out at all. And so one of the things that I really appreciate is that there's this acronym. Hopefully you can explain it to us in a second or two. FIRE, right? And so in the book, there's people who are really probably all almost obsessed with this notion of fire. And you kind of, you don't call them out, but you do say that that's not the only approach. And so we have the FI portion of the acronym and the RE, and you're not necessarily one who supports the RE. And so I was wondering if you can just briefly explain the acronym and then talk a little bit about why RE isn't necessarily the goal. It certainly wouldn't be the goal for me.
Well, and I think it more accurately, it's not that I don't support it. It's just, it was never my goal.
Gotcha.
So the acronym stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. And you'll notice in my writing on the blog, for instance, I never refer to FIRE. I always refer to FI, Financial Independence. Because certainly if you achieve FI, you can choose to retire early, but it's only one of the choices. And the problem with that is that I have yet to meet somebody who achieved financial independence. I've met a lot of people who achieve financial independence and they quit their regular job, whatever corporate kind of job they might have had. But I've yet to meet any of them who then did nothing for the rest of their life, especially because a lot of these people are very young when they achieve that goal. And so they go on to do other things. And some of those other things wind up paying them money. And Mr. Money Mustache, who's a great blog, has dubbed what he calls the Internet Retirement Police, who will say, somebody says, I fired and I retired early, and the Internet Retirement Police come out of the woodwork saying, well, you're not retired because you're writing a blog and that makes money, or you're doing this and that makes money. And so for me, the point isn't whether or not you are working by whatever definition somebody else has of what work is. Financial independence means that work is now optional. The job you have now is optional. I've actually had people, I've had conversations with who achieve financial independence. They have enough money, they don't have to work. And they'll say to me, I love my job. I don't want to give it up. And it's like, well, there's no rule here that says when you become FI, you have to quit.
Yeah, of course.
You have more options. And by the same token, every step on that journey, the stronger you get financially, the more options you have. Until when you're fully FI, then, work itself is optional. But you're probably going to choose to do something else after that.
Yeah, how could you not? It seems almost impossible.
I mean, it would be a pretty terrible life to sit and do nothing.
Yeah,
I think in prison they call that solitary confinement.
Yeah, exactly. That's not a reward for all your hard work at all.
Yeah, right.
So we mentioned before we started recording, I've been working on a sabbatical, or towards a sabbatical, on the topic of future of humanity and artificial intelligence. I've just been gobbling up lots of books on artificial intelligence specifically, and so I'm currently reading this one by the guy who founded DeepMind, which is an artificial intelligence that was later purchased by Google. His name is Mustafa Suleyman. And in a lot of these books, there's this kind of theme of, you're making predictions when you're talking about the future, and it's tough to say how those are going to work out. But there's one that seems to come up often. It's a matter of when it'll happen. So I was hoping I could just read you a short paragraph and get your thoughts on it.
Please do.
Yeah. Okay, good. I have the page marked. It'll just take me a second to get here. All right. This has to do with finances. All right. So this particular book, The Coming Wave, is going to be implications of our advancements in artificial intelligence. So the closing sentence from the previous paragraph says, much of what we've seen around us is powered by human intelligence in the direct pursuit of monetary gain, right? So we invent things and hopefully we get paid for those things along the way. So this engine has created a world economy worth $85 trillion and counting. From the pioneers of the Industrial Revolution to the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs of today, technology has a magnetic incentive in the form of serious financial rewards. The coming wave represents the greatest economic prize in history. It's a consumer cornucopia and potential private profit center without parallel. Anyone looking to contain it must explain how distributed global capitalist system of unbridled power can be persuaded to temper its acceleration, let alone leave it on the table. And so it's essentially, I mean, it amounts to the idea that before whatever happens in the long-term future, there's going to be a lot of money to be made here. And so I'd like to get some of your initial thoughts on that, if you have any, and then maybe break down a couple of points along the way.
Well, I'm not, I mean, that's strikes me as a very, very broad topic, right?
Yeah.
So if I can take maybe one sliver of it, and I'm not sure if this is what you're really asking me, and if it's not, then you can.
Yeah, we'll come back to it.
Yeah, you can get back to it and what have you. But I'm sure that, in fact, AI is already creating new businesses and generating lots of money, and it's attracting a lot of capital. There is nothing new in this. I mean, every stage, really going back to, well, probably going back to the beginning of human history, but in more modern times, going back to about the 1600s, when I think I want to say it was the Dutch who really created the first idea of capitalism, right? And taking capital and investing it and taking a risk, hoping for returns. So if you had capital, you might back a guy who's going to build a ship, or you might back somebody who owns a ship to draft a crew and a captain to go out and take it to some far corner of the world with goods to trade and hopefully come back with goods. And if that ship didn't get lost to pirates or high seas or storms or what have you, you stood to make a healthy profit. And if you were smart, you probably spread your risk across multiple ships, hoping that a couple of them came back. And so that's a process that's been going on in the modern age for 500 years, let's say. And it's created an incredibly prosperous world. There's a book I'll recommend called Factfulness that by a Swedish guy whose name always eludes me. He's passed away now. But I think Factfulness came out probably 2016, 2017. But he talks about the actual facts around the human condition today. And the truth is, we've never been richer. We've never been healthier. There's never been less poverty. There's never been less disease. There's never been fewer wars. I mean, everything on the spectrum is enormously better than it has ever been before. And it's because of this process, right? And because wealth is created. And I think AI is just going to be the next step in that. There will be more wealth created with that. And that wealth dissipates. Ben Carlson writes a blog, a column called A Wealth of Common Sense. And he did a post not too long ago, I want to say maybe last week, and in my newsletter, and if you want to put this in the show notes, I can find it for you. In my blog newsletter, I just referenced this this particular article because, there's the old saw, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Well, the first part of that is true. The rich do get richer, but the poor get richer too. And in fact, looking at Ben's charts, the poor, the bottom quartile, have actually gotten wealthier at a faster pace than any other group. The group that is lagging behind, although still getting richer, because every group is getting richer, are the middle class. So, the poor percentage-wise are getting richer, and then followed by the top, and then, different segments in the middle. So anyway, the world is getting much better. And that's because as these new technologies and new industries and new businesses are created and blossom, that has an effect of spreading the wealth, right? So if you look at Amazon as an example, and Jeff Bezos is a frequent whipping boy for people who don't like capitalism, and why should he have those billions of dollars? And because he created something that is worth that because collectively we find value in what he created. But it didn't just make him rich. It made countless people wealthy who invested in it, who've worked in it. It's provided countless jobs, and for the most part, I mean, The Simple Path to Wealth, my book, wouldn't exist if it weren't for Amazon, because I self-published it on Amazon. So I hear from people all the time who tell me how, my book, The Simple Path to Wealth, has made their lives measurably better and given them great hope. Well, if Jeff Bezos hadn't created Amazon, no publisher would have touched that book. And I know that because I had publishers turn it down.
Because no publisher touched it. Yeah.
Right. So, I think it's what people lose sight of is that, yes, if you are successful in creating something, whether it's Amazon or Tesla or Microsoft or whatever, or Ford back in the day, you have the potential to become enormously rich. But you can't do that without enormously benefiting the world around you.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that corporations don't sometimes do bad things, and pollution and that kind of thing. So, there has to be a level playing field that has requirements around not permitting that sort of thing. But that's the system we live in, and I imagine that's going to continue with AI.
Yeah.
Of course,
that's great.
There's something unique about AI that we can go into if you want, but
Oh, absolutely. That's kind of exactly what I was looking for when I read that passage. I put your initials right next to it. I was like, oh, you bring this up when you talk to JL,
yeah.
Mostly because the last time we talked, and if you haven't listened to the last interview that we had, I'd strongly encourage you to do so. I learned a lot, and I think anybody who listens to it can learn a lot. But one thing in your book, The Simple Path to Wealth, you show this chart of the stock market always kind of going up. I mean, there's going to be peaks and valleys, but it's the trajectory that keeps going higher. Yeah. So one of the most important things I learned was that it does no good to just save money, because if you just save your money, you're losing money. It starts to depreciate in value, or it doesn't keep up with the cost of cereal and bread, right, and things like that. And so when I read that, I was like, it's just a good reminder that it's good to get into the stock market, especially if there's something that's manageable like an index fund.
Right. And, as long as human beings are creative and striving to make their lives better and make the world around them a better place, then, that's the energy behind stocks. I like to say, when I tell my daughter to invest in VTSAX, which is Vanguard's total stock market index fund, when she invests in that, she now owns a piece of every publicly traded company in the United States of America. And everybody in those companies, from the factory floor to the CEO, is working to make her richer.
Right. Now,
obviously, they're working to get paid. They're working to see their investment pay off. They're working to see their products and services blossom. But in the process of doing that, because as investors, we own a piece of that, they're also making us richer. That's an incredible dynamic. Yeah. And that's why the stock market, while it's very volatile and it plunges periodically, which, by the way, is a perfectly normal part of the process, should never create the panic that it does in the media. But that's the price we have to pay to get the advantage, the growth of being in stocks in the long term, because it always recovers.
I tend to take your daughter's approach, where I put the money in and I don't watch. Like my stomach probably can't handle it when it drops, but I don't care. It's gonna be there when I'm ready for it. So that's all I really care about.
Well, that's a good way to do it. But the other thing is to remember that when it drops, there's nothing unusual happening. It's like hurricanes in Houston. Every now and again they come up.
Yeah.
They're scary, they're dangerous. If you run out in the middle of it in a panic, you can get seriously injured. But if you hunker down and you don't panic, the hurricane doesn't last forever. It goes away and the sun comes out and growth begins again.
That's a really perfect analogy. I mean, hurricane's good. It brings water, it brings rain, and there's some good stuff that can come from it as well. So I mentioned a second ago that if for anybody who hasn't listened to our first show, I recommend it. And we had a great talk, but there's a couple of questions that I received after some of the listeners heard that, or some of our readers followed along on it. And I was wondering if I could throw those questions out to you now.
Absolutely. Let's go for it.
All right. So the first two have to do with age on both ends of the spectrum. One was about what would you do, or what would you recommend? I don't know if you like giving recommendations, but if you were in this position and you had a young person who you wanted to start a college fund for, would you look at something like, I think it's a 529, or would you look at just going all in on index funds when somebody's born or very young?
Yeah, so this is a tough question for me because I have not stayed up to date with those things because my daughter is now 31. So I haven't really looked at that kind of thing in, I don't know, 20 years.
Yeah.
But I do remember when I looked at them, I chose not to use any of those tax advantage plans. And to the best of my memory, and it is testing my memory, I think the reason for that was it just felt to me like the restrictions outweighed the benefits.
Okay.
What I chose to do was simply continue to invest in my own accounts to make myself as financially strong as possible. So when it came time for her to go to college, I had the resources available to help. And in her case, she got a nice scholarship, and then I was able to make up the difference, and we didn't have to get any of those awful student loans. Now, having said that, there might be different things available now. Some of the restrictions might have gotten better. They might have gotten worse, for that matter. But it's not something I would do automatically. I'd look at it very carefully and make sure that before you engage in one of those things, you understand what the restrictions are that could come back and maybe not be so positive. So, it's like a lot of things in life. You have to weigh the potential benefits, which for these things are tax advantages, against whatever restrictions they have, and how the money can be used, and how it might affect the potential for student aid, things like that.
Perfect. I mean, that makes sense. Do your research.
Yeah.
So the other one is on the other side. This is more on the retirement side. So somebody who's out of the accumulation stage and maybe hasn't quite achieved financial independence, where they're still maybe cutting corners to get by, but they do have a retirement, they do have some money. What would you recommend somebody who is retired, no longer in the accumulation stage, do in terms of their investments?
Well, so that's kind of tough because I don't know exactly what their situation is, right? But that whatever investments it depends on what the shortcoming is. So you take using the 4% guideline, right? That you can basically withdraw about 4% of your assets every year and expect them to last for the long term. So if you have $500,000, that means you can pull $20,000 a year. And then you have to look at Social Security. And then if those two things are not enough, you have to do one of two other things. You have to go back to, I don't know if we recorded our conversation about my buddy Tom, but my buddy Tom, who reached the age of 62 and was bankrupt and lost his house to foreclosure. And so what Tom had to do is take his Social Security early. He had a tiny pension from one of the companies he worked for, like a couple $100 a month. And then he got a part-time job that keeps him outside and active and busy that he loves doing. So you either have to find that extra part-time job, or you have to restructure your life and your expenses so that it fits into whatever resources you actually have.
Yeah, that makes sense too. Now, for somebody in, I guess, that retirement stage, so you talk a little bit about, in some cases, switching to bonds. Is that something that you recommend, or not necessarily, or just depends on the person and their situation?
Well, everything depends on the person, their situation, but speaking in broad strokes,
Yeah.
so for somebody young, like my daughter, like you, who is working and have income coming in, they have cash flow. Again, you're living on less than you earn. So a portion of that, and hopefully a fairly large portion of that, you're diverting into your investments, right? And that, of course, builds your wealth, but it also smooths that volatility of stocks. So when the market takes one of its periodic drops, whether it's a 10% correction or a 40% crash, you're taking advantage of that, assuming you don't panic, because you're still investing that same amount of money. You're just buying those shares on sale now. And that's a wonderful thing that is very powerful in building your wealth. In fact, I've said that the best thing that can happen to somebody young building their wealth is a major stock market crash that drives the prices down. So in those early years, you're picking them up on a bargain. Now, when the time comes and you are living on your portfolio, you're no longer trading your labor and your time for money. You don't have a paycheck coming in. Most people are going to want something else to replace that cash flow to smooth the volatility of stocks, right? So where you had the cash flow before, now you might want to have bonds, because bonds can play that role. And so and it depends on how you feel about the volatility. It depends on, frankly, how close to the edge you are. So in the example we talked about earlier with the older person, they probably want to have some money in bonds to smooth the ride. Somebody who is very well fixed and is saying, I'm not withdrawing anywhere near 4%. I'm, pulling 2.5%.
Yeah.
Well, that person could be all in stocks. Now, the trade-off is that stocks are going to give you a much better result over time. The drawback of stocks is that volatility. Bonds are going to give you a smoother ride, much less volatility, but much less performance over time.
Okay.
So the more bonds you add, the less volatility you have to deal with, but the less you're going to have as an end result. So that's a very personal decision. For me, I think the ideal mix is kind of 25% bonds, 75% stocks. The traditional advice is 40% bonds, 60% stocks. Some even go 50-50. You don't want to go below 50% in stocks, because if you do that, then your portfolio doesn't have enough growth in it that you only get from stocks to survive for the long term. So you need at least 50% stocks. And I'm frankly more comfortable, because that growth is so important, closer to 75%. But again, it depends on what's more important to you, a smooth ride or that growth.
That's such great advice. No, that's perfect. So this last question that I got, it might make sense to you, it might not. It doesn't make much sense to me. But this actually came up in the climbing gym. There was a conversation, we were talking a little bit about this, and this one retired guy who I know, I mean, we climb together often enough. Somebody asked him, like, what do you do? And he's like, Vanguard. And I was like, okay, Vanguard. I know a little bit about that. One of the other guys was talking about insurance investments and thought that was a really positive direction to go. And I don't know anything about that. I was wondering what your thoughts are on, I don't even know enough to say if I'm saying it right, but investing in life insurance that accumulates wealth somehow as well.
Yeah. So what if he's talking about life insurance, what he's probably talking about is whole life insurance. I'm not an expert in this, but the idea behind whole life insurance is that you're buying life insurance, which pays a benefit if you die to your heirs, but it also builds a cash value. Now that's as opposed to buying what's called term insurance, where you are just buying the insurance. So you're not building any cash, but if you die, your heirs get whatever the policy's worth. If it's a $500,000 policy, your heirs get the $500,000. So at first blush, you might say, well, of course, I want the one that builds cash value. Problem is that is going to cost a lot more in premiums per month. And if you don't maintain those premiums, then you lose everything that you've built.
Okay.
And it's also laden with very, very high fees and commissions.
Okay.
And that's why these are very aggressively pushed by insurance salespeople. Sometimes insurance salespeople are calling themselves financial advisors. So you have to be very careful about that. But they have a very strong financial incentive to sell these products. I am not a fan. My world, invest to invest in broad-based low-cost index funds. And if you feel the need for life insurance, then buy term life insurance to the extent that you need. And instead of paying for that whole life policy, take that extra you would have paid for that you're saving in your term and put it in your VTSAX.
Yeah, I think I didn't know enough about it, but it definitely comes out in the last book that you wrote, that if you have money, just invest it and make it work for you. Quit giving your money to other people. Here's
a rule of thumb, right?
Yeah.
If somebody is selling you an investment, they're trying to convince you to buy an investment, by definition, that is an investment that is going to be paying that person money, because that's their job. Otherwise, how are they making a living? And that money is going to come out of your pocket, right? So anything that is being actively sold to you is probably not a good idea. It's probably not a good thing for you. So you will never have an insurance guy call you up, for instance, and try to actively sell you term insurance, because there's not that much money in it for them. You will frequently have people calling to sell you this idea of insurance and investment package together in something like whole life insurance. So be very cautious. Always, when somebody's pushing something towards you, always be aware of what their financial incentive is.
That's great. Yeah, if there's a price tag, be skeptical. Maybe that's the rule.
Well, just understand, understand how they're getting paid, right?
Yeah, with your money. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you've got 3 books so far written, right?
I do.
A lot more on your blog. I'm wondering if we're getting a 4th book, or if you're already starting to write book number 4.
Well, writing books is painful. It's a lot of work. As I think I mentioned earlier, it took 2 years to produce Pathfinders. So my first book was in 2016, and here we are in 2023. And the second book didn't come out until 2021. And that was kind of a fun little book that I did. So that wasn't quite as painful. But it took me years to get over the pain of writing Simple Path to Wealth.
Yeah.
So it'll probably take me a few years to get over the pain of writing Pathfinders. So there is nothing on the drawing board at the moment.
All right. So I was brainstorming for you. I had a couple ideas. Feel free to throw them in the trash bin. One, like, who wouldn't want to read your autobiography? Like, I want to find out about a young JL selling fly swatters. That's the first idea. I think there's a market for it. And the other one is, you're so well read. Again, I mentioned your section on the website about books that you recommend. I think you have a fiction somewhere in you. Like, I feel like you could pull off some fiction of somebody who invested some money some way or another. So those are my 2 ideas. Take them or leave them.
Well, so I'll comment on that. First of all, I'll say the book section on the blog I have sorely neglected. I have not kept that up to date at all, and I'm a very prolific reader, and I just never remember to, and some of the things that I read are forgettable, so they wouldn't go up there anyway. But in terms of my life story, an interesting thing, and I don't think I'll ever publish this, but I am trying to pull it together for my own benefit, because I find, I'm in my 70s now, and I find that frequently I'll be walking along and all of a sudden I'll have some memory from some time in the past of some interesting or odd or even unfortunate thing that I did or that happened. that I hadn't thought about for a long time. And it makes me realize that a lot has happened in my life, and I don't remember it, or at least I don't consciously remember it, but every now and again it comes together. So I'm trying to sort of keep a log of those things and to put together a chronology just for my personal use, so I understand my own life better.
That's so cool.
I do. And I think that's kind of, I wish I'd started it earlier and then sort of kept it up as my life unfolded. But the fiction thing is, I've often thought, and in fact, you're right, if I think I'm done writing about financial things.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I've kind of said what I have to say, and it's a path I've been down a lot. But I've always had an interest in writing fiction, and I've started doing a little bit of it. I think it's much more difficult than nonfiction.
I do too.
And yeah, so I have a lot of respect for fiction writers, and so far I don't, you know, I'm not happy with what I've done. So I don't think it'll ever see the light of day.
All right.
But that is something that interests me, and I am starting to fool around with a little bit. And I intend to fool around with a little more now that Pathfinders is done, and you know,
you got a little bit more time, freedom, thought,
a little more time, a little more freedom, and get a little distance and rest from the writing process.
Yeah, I understand. So last time we talked, I asked you for a couple recommendations. You recommended Sapiens as a book. I asked you your favorite sunset. JL's an incredibly well-traveled human being. And of all the sunsets, he mentioned one in Ohio, of all places. And so I was wondering if maybe we can finish our talk today with a few more recommendations. I was wondering if maybe you could throw another book our way. And then if you could throw a restaurant. If you're like, this is a restaurant, I feel like if you're in the area, you should try this. And then I have one more recommendation after those two.
Well, wow, you put me on the spot here. So sticking with financial books, I think The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel is a terrific book. And I think in many ways it's the ideal companion to The Simple Path to Wealth. Now, I'm not diminishing Pathfinders. Pathfinders is sort of the ideal follow-up to Simple Path to Wealth.
Right.
But Psychology of Money is sort of the ideal companion. So that's the book that is most on my mind at the moment. Awesome. as I'm thinking about this. As I mentioned, I actually think Pathfinders of The Simple Path to Wealth and Pathfinders, for somebody who's new to this concept of pursuing FI, Pathfinders is probably the better place to start, because you can read about people who've done it. And, you know, as you mentioned, well, it's my book, so most of the writing in it is mine, or I get the biggest portion of it. And in those sections, as I'm introducing each of the 9 sections, you'll get a feel for what the simple path is, because it relates to the stories. But yeah, so I think that's book-wise. Restaurant-wise, you know, we don't go out to restaurants all that much. Okay. And so I don't know that I have a recommendation. I can tell you a restaurant story.
Let's hear it. I'll take it.
This is a restaurant that's probably long gone. In my corporate career, I had the opportunity to entertain clients, which meant that I got to go to a lot of restaurants I wouldn't have otherwise been able to go to.
Okay.
And outside of Chicago, I doubt if it's still there, because this goes back to the 80s. There was a restaurant called Le Francais. And at the time, it was rated the #2 restaurant in the country. And
oh, wow.
I had the occasion to go a couple of times. And I liked it for a couple of reasons. One is the food was incredible. But the other thing is the service was impeccable. And in those days, in a lot of French restaurants, they had this idea that, you know, that to be genuinely French and good service, they had to kind of be nasty and snotty and, you know, kind of abrupt. And the nice thing about Le Francais is they weren't anything like that.
Oh, good.
They were very accommodating. You never want it for anything. Your water glass was always full. But you never even noticed them doing it, right? So it was very unobtrusive. They never interrupted a conversation. Just incredible service to go along with the incredible food. And at one point during the dinner, I was making that observation to the people that I was with. And the waiter must have overheard me, because when he came to clear away the dishes, when we'd finished the meal, I had fish, and my plate was completely clean. The food was that good. The only thing left on my plate was the very ornately carved lemon garnish for the fish. And the waiter reaches down and he puts his finger and his thumb on the plate to lift it up. But before he does, in his best haughty French accent, he says, "Pardon me, sir, but was there something wrong with the lemon?"
That's awesome.
And we all burst out laughing, of course.
That is so good. Man, I'm going to Google it. I got to find out if this place is open still. You're right. It's probably not, but that's so
well,
good.
if it is, bring lots of money if you go.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'll tell you, the one other story I'll tell you about Le Francais is they had valet parking, and we walked out and said goodbye to our guests, and my wife and I were waiting for the valet, or the valet came up to us and asked, which you didn't have tickets, and nothing as gauche as having a valet ticket. They would just come up and ask you which car was yours. Sure. And there was a Rolls Royce parked right in front. So this young man comes up to me. He says, "Which car is yours, sir?" And I said, as casually and as authoritatively as I could muster, I said, "Oh, it's the Rolls right there." And he got a little hesitant and flustered, and he sort of summoned his courage, and he said, "No, which car is yours?" And I got as indignant as I could muster.
That's so funny.
Right. And I said, "Excuse me, I just told you it's
the
Rolls right there." And now this poor kid is really a little flustered, and it took him a little longer to work up his courage. And he said, "Well, no, really, sir, which car is yours?" And finally I said, "Well, it's the crappy brown Chevrolet over there." So he runs off to get it, and I will say I tipped him very well for putting up with me. But as I'm getting in the car, and he's holding the door, I said, "I got to ask you a question." I said, "How were you so sure that's not my Rolls?"
Yeah.
And he said to me, "Mister, even in a place like this, when somebody arrives in a Rolls, we remember who they are."
Oh, yeah. No, for sure. So get in your Chevrolet and get out of here.
Right. Yeah. Get in your crappy Chevrolet and hit the bricks, pal.
All right. Last recommendation. Imagine it can be a young version of you in 2023. It could be just somebody you don't know. It doesn't matter. There's a young person who stumbled across, they're trying to jump on the path, and they want to take somebody out on a date. Trying to save a little money. What's your date recommendation? First date recommendation from J.L. Collins.
You do realize, or maybe you don't, you're talking to a guy who's been married for 42 years.
You did something right. Like, you've got to have some advice.
Well, I married a saint who's extraordinarily, as I say in the foreword to Pathfinders, in the acknowledgments, and I give Jane credit for putting up with me, and I say it's surprising that she hasn't stabbed me in my sleep, and I'm grateful for that. So yeah, asking me for dating advice, I'm not sure I was all that good at dating back 40 plus years ago. Yeah. when I was actually doing it. But I will tell you a story around that, seeing as I can't give you any advice.
Perfect.
I frequently get asked, how important is it that your partner and you are financially compatible? And it's very, very important. right? And so I highly encourage people that before they get into a committed relationship of any kind, that especially if they're going to start sharing financial things, that they make sure that they understand, how the other person feels about this stuff.
Yeah.
Because the biggest conflict in marriages, from what I understand, is financial conflicts. And then I would follow that story up by saying, in my personal case, I just happened to get extraordinarily lucky because when my wife and I were dating, we never talked about this stuff. And after we got married and, we started merging our lives together, it turned out that we're very compatible. We're like exactly on the same page, but that was just sheer dumb luck on my part.
Yeah.
Well, one day I was telling that story in front of my wife and she listens to it. And when I'm done, she says, "What are you talking about?" On our first date, you said to me, "You need to be saving 50% of your income."
That's so great. That's so you.
It is so me. And I honestly don't remember
That's
doing
so
that,
funny.
but I absolutely believe I did.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's
So
great.
evidently she and I talked about it more than I remembered. That's another reason I have to keep that log and try to figure out what actually went on in my life.
What did I actually say?
Clearly I'm a little foggy on the subject.
No, that's perfect. So let me give one more recommendation and then we'll see if you have any parting thoughts. But Christmas is right around the corner. I personally can't think of a better stocking stuffer than a book. And so I want to strongly recommend Pathfinders to anybody. It'll fit perfectly in a stocking. It's an awesome read. And JL's 100% right. This is honestly, if you're just kind of starting on this path, it's a perfect first step into it. So that's my recommendation for a stocking stuffer for anybody listening. And then JL, I want to turn it back to you. See if you have any parting shots or closing thoughts before we go.
Well, I tell you what, if you or anybody else wants to give me a Christmas present, if you read Pathfinders and you like it as you evidently do, please take a moment and put a 5-star review on Amazon, because at the risk of sounding immodest, I think it's an important book because I think it's a great introduction to this whole idea of becoming FI and the benefits of walking down the path. And anybody who's done it will tell you it's made their life far better. And so if anybody reads Pathfinders and it resonates and you agree that it has that value, then the best thing you can do to spread the word about it is to put those reviews on Amazon are incredibly important. So if you take a moment, put a 5-star review up, you will have done me a solid, and you will probably have done the people who follow your advice and read Pathfinders and maybe The Simple Path to Wealth after it a solid as well.
That's perfect. JL, thanks a million for joining us once again. And I can't wait to have you back on sometime soon.
Hey, as I said before we started recording, I'll come anytime you invite me. I always have a blast hanging out with you.
Awesome. Thanks, JL.
All right, man. Take care.
Yep, you too.